think there's something that's particularly galling about feeling brutalized by your own government, that makes people take it to the streets in a way that other kinds of discrimination and other manifestations of white supremacy haven't.
Aloha. I'm Robert Perkinson, and today's conversation really takes us to the heart of the country's historic reckoning with racism. There's nothing really new, of course, about discriminatory policing or even racially charged police killings. There's nothing even really new about race baiting from the White House. What is new is that movement has gained new force that's demanding this reckoning, that's demanding we don't forget the names and the lives of people like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many more, and is demanding that this country take, as it only does in response to movements, bolder, bigger steps toward justice. I'm very happy to be hosting the show today with my friend and colleague, Ken Lawson, UH law professor and co-director of the Hawaii Innocence Project. He's been working on these issues for many years. For about the first 40 minutes or so, we will be talking with the indomitable Paul Butler. And in the last 20 minutes, we will turn the conversation to Hawaii, and we'll be bringing on Kamaile Maldonado, who's a public policy advocate at the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Ken, let's get started.
All right, thanks, Robert. So let me introduce our guest speaker for today. It's Paul Butler. He's a law professor at Georgetown University and a former federal prosecutor. For more than 25 years, he has researched and written about race in the criminal legal process. Professor Butler is the author of many scholarly articles published in leading journals, including the Law Reviews of Georgetown, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, and 2 books, including Chokehold, Policing Black Men. As a federal prosecutor with the United States Department of Justice, Professor Butler specialized in prosecuting corrupt federal law enforcement officers. Professor Butler also served as a prosecutor in the District of Columbia, prosecuting misdemeanor street crimes. And, you know, as a former criminal defense attorney, it's very rare where I get to welcome someone who I actually respect that was a former federal prosecutor. But thanks for joining us, Professor Butler.
It's great to be here. I'm a recovering prosecutor. I still like to point my finger sometimes, but the bad guys have changed.
That's right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And again, one, we appreciate you being here, but there's so many important issues going on in our community throughout the nation, actually worldwide, with respect to race and policing. But just to start it off, at one point you had talked about the criminal justice system in America is designed for Black men. What did you mean by that?
So first, let me just thank Professor Perkinson and you, Professor Lawson, for this great invitation and for hosting me. I know that Camille Nelson is in the house as well, my good friend. You're very fortunate to have her as the new dean of your great law school. So it's really an honor to be here with you all. When I talk about the chokehold, what I mean is that the criminal legal process is designed for African-American men. When we ask, how did things get so bad? When we look at mass incarceration, when we look at brutal policing, when we look at wretched prisons, all of those are about Black men. It certainly doesn't mean that we are the only people who are the subjects of that subordination. A lot of other people are. I think we're going to hear that about issues in Hawaii. Black women, transgender people, immigrants, Latinx people, all of those people suffer under our criminal legal process. But when we ask, how did things get this way? Why are things so bad? The control of African-American men, the subordination, is the reason why.
Paul, you know, mistreatment, harassment, discrimination, even killing by police is sadly not something that's new in the U.S. How far back does this go, and why do you think there's this entwinement between racism and policing that seems so difficult to disentangle?
It's really interesting to look at how stereotypes have traveled over time, including stereotypes about Black men. So during slavery, we weren't criminal-minded or violent. And that makes sense if you think about the close proximity between Black enslaved people and white folks. So it wasn't until emancipation that in the American imaginary, Black men became brutal. So there were certainly stereotypes during slavery. Black men were comical or foolish or heathens, but we weren't scary. After emancipation, you see these new images of Black men as violent, as brutal, and as lasciviously attracted to white women. And that goes hand in hand with the old Jim Crow, with the black codes, and then the new Jim Crow. And so these stereotypes about Black men are instrumental, they're functional. They, like the criminal legal process, do the work that slavery did, and then that the old Jim Crow did, and now that the new Jim Crow is doing.
This obviously takes a lot of different forms too. I was struck, one of the things I was struck by in your book is how you note that it's the mistreatment by police, killings by police in particular, that have most provoked Black uprisings over the course of the late 20th century and the early 21st century. Explain what you mean by that, and also why do you think, of all of the injustices that African Americans face in the US social and economic system, why do you think it is that police misconduct strikes this nerve with such force?
You know, if you look at the history of African American resistance, Black folks have endured with relative patience a host of evils. So after emancipation, we can think about the Black codes, we can think about convict leasing, or we can think about separate water fountains in schools, we can think about poisoned water in Flint. And for almost all of those kinds of subordination, Black people have petitioned the courts, petitioned the legislatures, nonviolent marches, all of the images that come to your mind when you think about Martin Luther King, for example. But the times that African Americans have abandoned those traditional civil rights protests and instead taken to burning things in the street or attacking symbols of the state, almost all of those have been because the police killed another Black person. And I'm interested partly just in the data. So if you look at Black uprisings, again, almost every single one is because the police have killed another Black man, usually. And I think that there's something visceral about feeling under attack by the agents of the state who were supposed to serve and protect you. I think there's something that's particularly galling about feeling brutalized by your own government that makes people take it to the streets in a way that other kinds of discrimination and other manifestations of white supremacy haven't.
We talked a little bit before we came on the screen, and going to your point right there, when I practiced law in Cincinnati, Ohio, I did a lot of civil rights cases and represented a lot of families that were Black men, unarmed Black men had been killed by the police. And we had done peaceful protesting. We went down to City Hall, tried to get the attention of the chief of police, the safety director, except for years. And then within a 2-year period, the police had killed 15 unarmed Black men. And finally, in the last case that I did, Cincinnati erupted into riots. And it gets to the point that Robert was asking you and what you had just spoke about. There was something about being stopped and frisked. There's something about, when I was in high school and even in law school, right, being pulled over, asked to get out your car or ordered out your car, and then being frisked. There's something humiliating about that. There's something that just goes to the core. So just, it just brings up that anger, about the state using its power to put you back in your place, so to speak. And so when it erupted like that, People would say, the looting and the rioting doesn't work, but it was a combination of us attorneys working in the courts, those out there peacefully protesting, and to a certain extent, those that were in the streets raising holy heck and looting around, that got the business community at the table to tell the politicians, hey, you guys got to do something because this is affecting our bottom line dollar. What are your thoughts on that when people say that that none of this gets anywhere?
So I think the uprisings have been productive. I think that, unfortunately, and sometimes it takes, I'm trying to think of the right word. So I don't think of somebody throwing a brick through a store window as violent. I think of violence as something that's directed against people. And in Chokehold, I both acknowledge that sometimes the uprisings have been productive at getting, for example, the Justice Department to intervene, to quote unquote, take over a local police department, getting attention focused on the issues. At the same time, if violence means hurting another human being, then I'm against it. I'm against it because I think it's immoral, and I'm against it because I think it wouldn't work. If racial justice becomes a war with, let's say, Black people or freedom fighters against anti-Black terrorism against everyone else, if that becomes a physically violent war, then I think Black people get crushed. So I don't think it would work, and I think it's immoral.
Paul, what do you think is new about, in terms of the movement this time? I mean, you can go back and find W.B. Du Bois speaking out against police racism. You can find Malcolm X speaking about beatings and police killings in Harlem. There are obviously the string of uprisings from Newark and Detroit to Los Angeles to the present. Do you think this moment is fundamentally new, and why? Does it have greater promise, do you think, than some of the efforts that have come before?
So it's a great question, and to me, it's a great question for a historian. So I'm interested in part in what you think and about whether this moment is new, and you also, Professor Lawson, based on your experience. What feels different about this summer is the focus of non-Black people on anti-Black racism and on white supremacy. And for the first time, Black Lives Matter, the movement, is polling well among white folks. And in our history as a nation, I think that that's a singular achievement. We have a holiday now for Martin Luther King. We have schools named after Malcolm X. If you go back and look at their numbers, when they were alive, including Martin Luther King, most white people didn't approve of them. They thought they were moving too fast. They needed to be more patient, yada, yada, yada. And so the fact that now, this summer, a lot of white folks have gotten woke is new and different, not just for the fight against police violence, but really historically for the fight against racial justice. I think it's too soon to know whether, in the cliche, this is a moment or a movement. But another difference is the movement we've seen in the law, especially on the state level. And the state level is really where it's at, in part because the Trump administration and the Barr Justice Department are on the wrong side of history and on the wrong side of these issues. But it's also really important that the action is in the states because that's mainly where the problem is. So about 90% of people who are locked up, 90% of people who are prosecuted by state and local officials. And the president, the attorney general, doesn't have a lot of control or say over what they do. And the reason that's good news and the reason that this moment feels different is because if you look at places like New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., there's already been new laws passed. So reform means things like getting rid of no-knock warrants, requiring officers to wear body cams, forbidding officers from using chokeholds. So those laws have already been passed in a lot of state and local jurisdictions. And that's been since the police murdered George Floyd Memorial Day Monday. And so, again, that's what feels different.
I agree. I think this is a remarkable moment. I hope it becomes a movement. I think it's remarkable that the terms of debate are for once kind of determined by the opposition, kind of between police reform and defund the police, between a radical and a moderate kind of vision of reform. That makes me hopeful that at least significant modest reforms could take hold during this moment. Ken, what do you think? Are you optimistic about this moment? Or
Well, I can tell you why I think it's different, but before I get to that, going back to Paul's point, and I guess your point too, Robert, is, going back to the Rodney King verdict and then the uprisings in LA, Ferguson and Cincinnati, we had 4 days of rioting in 2001, in April 2001. The Justice Department did come in. We entered into a consent decree after we filed a class action lawsuit. But then it seems like everything goes back to normal. We saw Eric Garner, and Michael Brown, and then, like I said, all the uprisings in Ferguson. I think, at least for me, what was different and what I think caught, because normally it's just blacks out there protesting and everybody's getting angry. This has been different, as Professor Butler pointed out, because it has, went across racial lines, right? It's been it's went across our nation. It's just a global movement. But the difference to me was when I saw that video of that officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck, looking back into that camera, without saying a word, but it was just that look. Like, this is how we, your black life does not matter. I can put my knee on your neck and kill you on live video, and it doesn't matter. And I think that really painted that picture that blacks, and we have been talking about for years, that whites could finally open up and say, you know what, this is just wrong. Now, how long it's going to last, that remains to be seen. But it is different, to that extent. And I think we are seeing a lot of changes. But there are a lot that we have to address. I was going to ask Professor Butler, when you talk about the police unions, you talk about qualified immunity. It's hard to fire a police officer when they engage in this conduct. And if you do fire them, the one that killed the young man in Cincinnati that led to the riots got rehired after the city fired him and charged him with a crime, got rehired by another police department. Same thing that happened when the officer that killed Tamir Rice. And so when you have qualified immunity, in other words, you can't sue me. You can't fire me. You're not going to, if you do charge me with a crime, 99% of the jurors are going to acquit me. So what deters me from saying that your black life should matter? And I guess that's my question to Professor Butler.
So
that is a question.
You mentioned Tamir Rice. So people know that he's the 13-year-old child who was playing with a toy gun in a public park, and an officer rolled up, barely got out of his car before he shot the child dead. The car literally had not stopped moving when Tamir was killed by the police officer. And that officer was fired, but he got rehired, not by one, but by two different police departments. And people think, well, it's because they didn't know about this officer's history. In one instance, that was true. In the other instance, they knew, but they didn't care. They didn't think that it disqualified him from being a police officer. And that leads to the part of Professor Lawson's question about reform. So what Black people need is for the police to stop killing us and beating us up and arresting us in situations in which they would not do that to white people. And really what this movement for Black lives is about is how to make the police stop that. And the question is whether reform, like police requirements to use the cameras, or again, the bans on chokehold, getting rid of qualified immunity, whether that will make the police stop it. And I think that that's an open question, in part based on where we started. The problem isn't bad apple cops. The problem is the system is working the way it's supposed to. So if it ain't broke, there's nothing to be fixed. Mm-hmm. There's a nuanced, important literature on these issues of reform versus transformation, how they might work together, and at the same time, the tension between the two. So I think if we think about the death penalty, that's a way of understanding the tension. So a lot of people think that we should abolish the death penalty. At the same time, some of those folks work on reform. And because of reform, important achievements like now it's unconstitutional for the government to kill people who are children, who committed crime when they were children. It's unconstitutional for the government to kill people who are intellectually disabled. So those are positive reform movements. The concern is that they make the death penalty fairer. They make it seem more just, and ultimately, they might make it harder to abolish. Again, if we're not actually killing children or people who are intellectually disabled. And there's the same kind of tension now with regard to the police, with regard to incarceration, prison. If we work to make those institutions a little bit more humane, a little less anti-Black, we make it harder to transform them in the way that's necessary for Black people to realize equal justice under the law. And the nuance here is that, again, because this issue isn't new, there's been some really important work on it. And one scholar, a prison abolitionist, has talked about something called non-reformist reform. So the kind of reform that helps us get to transformation. And when my heroes like Angela Davis, who's a prominent abolitionist, have been asked about reform, again, they approve it as a route to victory, as a way to get towards abolition.
One of the problems, I think, with a lot of reforms, with policing in particular, this is true in prisons as well, is that necessary reforms are identified and more money is provided to the agencies to professionalize and train that allows the agencies to expand their purview. So of the sort of fixes that are on the table right now, from body cams to oversight review boards to diverting funding to other soft power agencies, which do you think show the most promise as real achievable reforms, but nonetheless could be bending the arc toward justice in a more substantial way?
So I think many of the reforms that are proposed in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020, so that's the bill that's proposed in the House by the Congressional Black Caucus and co-sponsored in the Senate by Senators Harris and Booker. A number of reforms that could make a difference. I had the honor of testifying in Congress in favor of this bill. And so what it would require is national requirements for police. There are 18,000 different police departments in the United States and 18,000 different ways of policing. The government has incentives to require every state to allow you to turn right on a red light, right? The government likes that, it wants to encourage that, and that's why it's the law in every state. They're not those same kinds of requirements regarding policing, even though these are folks who have the power to change your life in a moment. Certainly, and obviously, if they kill you or beat you up. But if you get arrested for a misdemeanor, as I've been, as many African-American people have been, that also can change your life. So these folks have this extraordinary power, and there are no national requirements. So I think that if there's if there are minimum requirements, training, competency, that could go a long way. You know, when I looked at whether reform worked, I focused on what a lot of the activists get when the police have been particularly over the top in cities, which is they want the Justice Department to come in and take over the local police department, a pattern and practice investigation. And, you know, this reform movement is about being smart on crime rather than tough on crime. So it looks at evidence-based approaches. So I was curious about the evidence of whether when the Justice Department comes in and takes over a local police department, it makes a difference. And what I found is that in about half of the places where DOJ comes, police violence goes down, police brutality goes down. The citizens, including the Black and brown citizens, feel better about the police. Those investigations are very expensive. So far as we know, the effects are short term, and they're politically contingent in a very specific way. If there's a Democrat in the White House, then the Department of Justice does those investigations. If there's a Republican in the White House, then it doesn't. This isn't a Trump thing. When George W. Bush campaigned for president, he sought the endorsement of the Fraternal Order of Police by saying he was going to call off the Justice Department. He didn't think it was right for them to meddle in local policing. And so when it works in that limited way, what it means is that the police kill and beat up fewer Black people. So no one can deny that that's a good thing, but it doesn't, like any other kind of reform, go nearly far enough. It doesn't transform policing and the criminal legal process in a way that African-American people need to be free. I went to the March in Washington, the Resistance March, I think it was called, a few weeks ago. Great t-shirts, as you can imagine. My favorite was a t-shirt that I think was riffing off the TV show Blackish. And I only saw people of color with this t-shirt on, but it said free-ish. I think that's an accurate way of describing, you know, the position of Black people in the United States. We're free-ish. And for Black people to be free, among other things, we need the criminal justice system to be transformed. We didn't talk about reforming slavery. We talked about abolishing it. And we didn't talk about reforming the old Jim Crow, right? We thought about abolishing it. And I don't think it's going to give us what we need if we just focus on reforming the new Jim Crow. We must abolish it.
You know, real quick, while you were talking about that too, you know, it's not just about reforming the police or abolishing the police. It's about this whole system. You know, you being a former federal prosecutor, me being a former criminal defense attorney. I mean, 40% of my clients are white, and they could do the same thing that my Black clients could do. We go in front of the same judge with, let's say, same charges, 6 months apart, one Black defendant, one white defendant with 2 different sentences. And a lot of prosecutors know when these cops come in with these trumped up misdemeanors or felonies, right? The disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. You know as well as I do, when we see those charges, this starts normally with a stop and frisk, where the young man is saying, you don't have a right to do this, and then it escalates. But most cops think, you know, they told me this when I was a teenager, who's gonna believe you? Who's gonna believe you over me when we get to court? My point is this, you know, the judges a lot of times and the prosecutors, everybody in court knows that the officer's lying. Most prosecutors can look at that officer and say, why in the heck are you bringing this charge in front of me? Most judges should say that. But if the cop knows when he's doing wrong on the streets, when he knows he's violating stop and frisk or the Constitution, but he also knows, that she knows in the back of her mind that when I get to court, ain't nobody gonna believe you. Even if the judge knows that what I did was wrong, he's not gonna uphold your constitutional right. So I'm gonna continue to do this. So, you know, Professor Butler, I just, you know, going to your point, we can reform the police, that's one, but it has to focus on the whole criminal justice system because they're all in cahoots. I don't know any other way to say it, but other than that, they know.
I have a I have a follow-up to that, Ken, because I think it's true that both you and Paul have a really unique perspective on the criminal justice system as scholarly experts, but also as practicing attorneys. Both of you also, of course, have had to navigate the over-policed streets of America as Black men, and both have ended up at different times as criminal defendants. And Paul has also sat on the other side putting people in jail. So I guess first to you, Paul, how do you think your experiences viewing criminal justice from all of those different vantage points has given you insight into how the system actually works and how it should work?
So I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was riding my bike as a 13-year-old kid to the library, which was literally across the tracks in the white neighborhood. When I crossed those literal and proverbial tracks, a cop car pulls alongside me. "Is that your bike?" I said, "Yes." "Is that your car?" And I sped away. When I got home, I told my mom what I'd said. My mom who marched with Martin, my mom who took it to the streets with Malcolm, and she spanked me. Didn't I know what happened to Black boys who talked to the cops like that? It turned out that she was right. At this time, the Chicago police were operating an off-site led by a lieutenant named John Burgess, where they were literally torturing Black men to get confessions. They were pouring soda up their noses. They were attaching electrodes to their genitalia. Now the city of Chicago has paid millions of dollars to Black men who were the victims of that kind of state terrorism. Why, having experiences like that, knowing what I know, would I become a prosecutor? I went in as an undercover brother. I was hoping that I could change the system from within. What I found was rather than me changing the system changed me. It's not like in the first day, I started calling defendants cretins and douchebags, which is how they were referred to in the prosecutor's office. That took a while. But lawyers are competitive, we're ambitious. The way you move up in a prosecutor's office is to lock up as many people for as long as you can. And it turned out that I was good at that. And prosecutor offices aren't the same paramilitary organizations as police departments, but there definitely is a spirit of core and also a sense that you're doing the Lord's work. So I got caught up, and Robert, you mentioned that I've been a defendant. So yeah, well, I graduated from doing local street crimes in DC to the Justice Department. And while I was a junior lawyer on the biggest case in the department, we were prosecuting a US senator for public corruption. While I was working in that case, I got arrested and prosecuted and went to trial for a crime that I didn't commit. So I tell the story of that arrest and trial in my first book, Let's Get Free. And I'm not going to tell you what happened because I want you to get the book. But
it's an amazing story.
I'll give you a hint. Things worked out fine for me. Things worked out fine because I had the best lawyer in town, a former public defender named Michelle Roberts, who now happens to run the National Basketball Players Association, but at that point was known as the best trial lawyer in DC. Things worked out fine for me because I had legal skills. The courtroom where I had my trial, I literally prosecuted people in the same room. And things worked out fine for me because I had social standing. We made sure the jury knew that I was a college and law school graduate, things that shouldn't have made a difference, but did. And the last reason things worked out fine for me is because I was innocent, but that wasn't the most important reason. I think I'd rather be guilty and have Michelle Roberts as my lawyer than innocent and have a lawyer who doesn't have the resources to fight my case in the way that it needed to be fought. So after that experience, I couldn't keep on prosecuting. My defense attorney friends, they get mad at me. They say it shouldn't have taken your own personal prosecution for you to learn what we've been saying all along. And that's exactly right. But what I say is that my own personal prosecution, it made a man out of me. It made a Black man out of me.
I think that's, one, I think it's important that we have, good prosecutors. And I tell my students this all the time, especially students of color, that we need good prosecutors that are prosecutors of color. But I also think, as you just pointed out, it's those personal experiences that happen to us that put something in the core of your soul where you just can't shake it. And as you know, as well as I do, Professor Butler, there are issues that you speak about, there are issues that you work on that aren't popular issues, but there's something that's deep down in your soul to where, if not you, then who, right? And people don't understand. I don't personally know you, I know of you, but I can probably guess that based on a lot of your writings, a lot of your public stances, that you take a lot of heat. And it's not something that we enjoy doing. But because of our personal experiences, there's just something about being that Black man that you know that you have a responsibility to your ancestors and the people that's going to come after us, right? And there's something that you cannot shake. And I think you just went through your personal experience a little bit later. Mine came when I was a teenager, and just the way, and even in law school and after law school, being stopped in airports, going from one city to another try a case by DEA, asking me to step in, and I'm like, and I knew my rights, right? I'm not going to explain to you I'm a lawyer, but why are you asking me in front of all these white people to come with you, right? And not making any noise. Why do you think that I'm dealing drugs? I'm sorry for going off on that, Robert, but I do think it's just, it makes for a better law. And I'm thankful that you're at Georgetown. I'm thankful that you're, doing what you do in your books and on MSNBC. And one final thing, the advice to, and I guess it talks about the survival guide for African Americans, and you mentioned that. And I want to, can you tell me what it is that you mean by that, the survival guide?
So, because I have had this unique experience as a prosecutor who locked up a lot of Black people, and then as a Black man who caught a case and went to trial and won, I wanted to pass some inside information along. And it actually started out as the whole book. It was going to be a guide for Black men about how to navigate the criminal legal process, how not to get stopped by the police. If you do get stopped, what you should do. If you catch a case, how to navigate your way through the system so that you could have a good outcome and not typical kind of street law stuff, but real talk from, again, both a former prosecutor and a former defendant about how to have the best outcome you can. While I was working on that, Trayvon Martin got killed, followed by Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, and so forth. And suddenly only focusing on what Black men should do didn't seem to rise to the occasion. So Trayvon Martin was on his way to his dad's house when he got killed. Mike Brown in Ferguson was supposed to start college the next week before he was killed. And so that's how the book became broader, but I still have that chapter, and folks can check out my Instagram page. We actually made a video of that chapter. It's called 10 Commandments for Black Men. So check out my Instagram and you can see the video version of that chapter. But what I did was talk to police officers about what it is that makes you focus on a brother harder, what I call the hard stare. And the stuff that they told me was sad, but consistent with my experience and the experience of a lot of brothers. 3 Black men in a car. Mm-hmm. A Black man with locks, a Black man with a white woman. So I have a long list of stuff like that. And going on through the process, like if you do catch a case, what should your defense attorney be doing? And I say, make sure that she's doing this and this and this. If the police are questioning you, but what do you say so that you don't get arrested, so that the stop doesn't devolve into an arrest? And again, real talk, and not stuff that you're going to hear in civics. And some people have said that, I say, for example, if you are going to trial and it's a jury trial and you have locks, you probably want to cut them off. You want to cut them across in a way that a mainstream, probably majority white jury is going to seem as respectable. And folks have said, man, that's kind of enforcing the politics of respectability, right? That's telling brothers that they shouldn't express themselves in the way that they want to. And I get it. But this is only about if you want to have the best outcome, if you want to keep your butt out of jail, if you want to keep your butt out of the attention, if you want to divert the hard stare that the police give. And I make clear that this is not something that you should have to do if you live in a free country. But the country that Black men live in, the country that Black women live in, is not a free country.
I was really struck by that section of your book, The Survival's Guide to Black Men in Chokehold, Paul, because it reinforced the point you two were making earlier about how personal this can be, those day-to-day experiences of suspicion and sometimes terror and humiliation. And your suggestions quite sensibly articulated that in order to avoid exacerbating those situations, you have to kind of adopt a performance of deference and docility toward these authority figures who may be treating you unjustly, maybe unlawfully. And it reminded me of the way that, slaves had to learn to code switch and speak in a certain way to the people who held their lives in their hands, the way that under Jim Crow, people had to learn to feign deference to people they didn't necessarily respect in order to avoid provoking violence. And it's a terrible testament to where we are in the 21st century, that kind of active daily performance is still necessary to survive.
And mad props to people who resist. So I personally think sagging is ridiculous. I'm probably too old to understand it. So people know that sagging is when young men wear their jeans real low so that you can see their underwear. I love the history of it. It's a tribute to people in prison. That's how it started, because in prison, they take away your belt because the conditions are so brutal. They're afraid that you're going to kill yourself. So that's how it started. I think it looks silly, but mad props to the young men who engage in it, because they know, I say this in that chapter, they know that it's going to make the police look at them extra hard. But again, they're expressing themselves. So I totally get that. And I know we're getting sort of on time, Robert. So just to conclude by thinking about something that Ken said earlier about, well, what is it that we can do? What is it that we should be doing? And what you said, Robert, about our own personal experiences. So I think sometimes if I'd been a slave, that I hope I would have been a runaway. I hope I would have been one of those people who led rebellions. The reality, though, is that most enslaved people didn't do that. And then if I'd been around during the old Jim Crow, I hope that I would have marched with Martin and taken it to the streets with Malcolm. The reality is most people, including most Black people, didn't do that. And the movement for Black Lives, what people say is, if you want to know what you would have done back in the day, ask yourself, what are you doing right now? Because this is one of the most important human rights struggles of our day. And I think we have to all be not just okay, but feel good about what we're doing right now.
Thanks, Paul. That's a very powerful way to conclude. Most of us here on this call have the opportunity to act now in Hawaii, where we have a different set of challenges, but no less deeply entrenched. So we want to invite Kamaile Maldonado to join our conversation now and talk about the distinct history of racism and colonialism and policing and criminal justice in Hawaii, and what we might do about it in the present to try and also move forward at a moment when we have an opportunity. We have a moment of opportunity, I think, as you're saying, to take action in a way that we hope we can feel proud of, and that our kids and grandchildren can look back and hopefully see that we also did something when confronted with a moment of injustice and reckoning. It was really nice of you to join us. Thank you for your work,
you very much.
your
Thank
voice, and your courage.
Thank you, brother. It was good.
Thank you both. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. we got off to a little bit start, so we may go a little bit beyond the hour. Many of our participants are sending us in questions. We're trying to get through those and reframing them and using them as we can. But let's hear now from Kamaile. Are you with us? Aloha.
Can you hear me well? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Aloha mai kākou, everyone. I'm so humbled and happy to be here to talk about this very important issue and to bring it back home to our shores in Hawaii. You know, just a brief history for those of us who aren't super familiar, the criminal justice system in Hawaii, as it's understood in modern times, started in the middle of the 19th century, so not very long ago, as a tool of colonization, of assimilation, to impose Western values upon Hawaiian people and to sever their relationship with their traditional ways of being and knowing. So the codes were developed by missionaries and foreign businessmen, and the historical texts of that time written by those people in power frame the Hawaiian people as feeble-minded, given to licentiousness and drunkenness. These laws that were really foreign and incomprehensible to Hawaiian people regulated things like family structures, enforced removal from land and subsistence practices, and cut people off from other lands and their communal interdependency. And most of all, they punished vagrancy. And so that was really the start of things. You know, to harken back to a point that Dr. Butler made, these laws were designed for Hawaiian people. They were designed specifically to enable this kind of cultural change and assimilation. And all these changes occurred at the same time as a blend of pandemics, which decimated the Hawaiian population by 92 to 95%. I think we are closer now than we maybe ever have been to really understanding what that feels like without it being possible to conceive of losing 95% of an entire population of a race during a very short period of time, and also the time when the massive changes in the government and the organization diluted Hawaiian power in the government. So this whole new system of privatized property and criminal justice laws were all systemically working together to aid in that dispossession. And so ever since the first prison was built on Oahu in 1857, it's been filled with Hawaiian bodies. Since that time, our state government has followed in this American model, both incrementally and rapidly building up these criminal laws to deal with every kind of social problem. And since that time, we've built 9 more facilities. We've overflowed them. We rent 1,400 bed spaces in a private prison in Arizona. And whereas Hawaiians today account for less than 20% of the statewide adult population, we are still nearly 40% of the incarcerated population. So, you know, when we look back at history, we can see that it wasn't a long thing. It wasn't a long march. It was really just a few short decades over 100 years ago where Hawaiians went from being a prosperous nation, well organized, to a foreign land, and Hawaiians were at that time criminalized for essentially surviving that change. And the system that we have today is built on that foundation, and it has somewhat evolved in its direction and its purpose as well.
How do you think it? Yeah, how do you think that the discrimination kind of functions most visibly in the system as it is managed now?
Well, yeah, so our racial dynamic in Hawaii is a little bit different, right? Because it's not so black and white. It's very much intermixed. But what I see when I look at the historical texts that have led to and have built upon to create the system that we see today, it's very much a system of cultural assimilation and of cultural superiority. So when we talk about, you know, the movement for Black Lives uses the white supremacy model of it's a lens to view like all of the history of laws. And I do think that there was that element there when we look back at that historical time. When we're looking at it now, it looks much more like a cultural supremacy, like those people who can really assimilate into this model and fit well into it, like Dr. Butler was talking about, you know, look the part, speak the part. This is what it is enforcing. And so, you know, at the time that these laws were created, they were intended to disrupt a certain way of life, and it still works that same way today. It's disrupting communities, it's dismantling families, it's reinforcing distrust in government systems, and perpetuating intergenerational cycles of poverty and trauma. So, you know, to use a phrase that Dr. Butler used, the system is working exactly as it's supposed to.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth. It seems like, again, obviously based on what you just said, and thank you for enlightening me on the history, or more enlightening me on that. But, you know, it started as a way to basically disrupt a culture, right? A race of people. And it seems like it's just doing what it's meant to do. I guess the question is, what type of reform do you think is needed for us to stop this cycle? Because again, to me, it starts with policing. I don't, here in Hawaii, I've been here for 12 years, but they don't police the same way in Waianae that they do in Kahala, right? And so when you talk about more Native Hawaiians being locked up in Arizona or in Halava or in OCCC, and people have that view that, well, they must be committing more crimes. But I can promise you, they doing drugs in Kahala the same way they do them anywhere else, right? But they ain't getting arrested and policed the same way.
Yes, definitely. So there are so many elements to this, but basically in recent decades, our state has really been grappling with concepts of reform, the racial dimension. You know, we have, when you talk about it starts with policing, our new chief of our police in Honolulu has many times disclaimed any level of implicit bias and has said, you know, this is not a problem. She believes that the movement for Black Lives should skip Hawaii because we're doing okay. And, you know, we don't have the racial problems that they have elsewhere, but it completely ignores kind of not only the history of the system itself, the systematic ways that law was used to dispossess and oppress people, but also the actual impacts, the current state of affairs. And so I think that, you know, policymakers and others who are kind of in government have been realizing that it has been at a tipping point for a long time. And so they've been kind of trying to look into reform, like we're talking about reform versus transformation. So it comes from different ways of looking at the problem, right? That, you know, some ways of interpreting it are that we're somehow racially or culturally predisposed to misbehavior, or that it's a problem of poverty, or the extreme inequity in the distribution of wealth in Hawaii, and that the impact could be just deepening the divide of distrust between the community and the state. And then there's as well the way of looking at it that is just a system that was originally built on white supremacist principles, and it continues to perpetuate cultural supremacy. So there's just many different elements of the ways of how we look at the problem, and how we articulate it is going to help us determine how we're going to address it. So we've spent countless hours and you know, many pages developing incremental piecemeal reforms over the last 20 years maybe. It's been an up and down, right? Because at the same time that we've been trying to chip away at the population, which has been ballooning and exploding in the last 40 years, we have also been piecemeal expanding criminalization in other areas. And so, you know, we're looking at ways to reform the system, try to make it more fair, try to make it more just. Only recently have policymakers really started entertaining ideas of a complete shift in the way that we think about the purpose of law and punishment, the models of envisioning a complete transformation of our system that can contribute to the community rather than destroy it. So a recent task force on prison reform wrote a lengthy report about uprooting the racism in this system and trying to change the way that we do corrections entirely. And so, and as well, this is not new to Hawaiians. Hawaiians have been talking about how we need to be reinstilling our own indigenous models of peacemaking and healing, because these can offer a much deeper form of healing for the people that are coming into contact with the system than anything else really can. But we're just kind of awakening to this crisis of the consequences of our policies. COVID has really tipped the scales in our jails and prisons in a really explosive way, and it's causing us to realize how dangerous and unsustainable this indifference has been for so long. So, you know, I'm hopeful that these kind of new ideas that have just kind of recently come to the fore in Hawaii will really take off after this moment that we're in right now, and especially with the movement for Black Lives kind of on the national level, kind of bringing up these ideas, this racial reckoning with our criminal justice system, with our governing systems in general.
Yeah, we're about out of time here, but a lot of participants have been sending in questions about COVID. And of course, we're seeing how the health inequalities and economic inequalities are pushing the epidemic forward in invidious and discriminatory ways. The prison population at OCCC has become the hotspot of transmission on Oahu. There's, you know, pretty clear data on discriminatory enforcement, or disproportionate, at least, enforcement by the police as well. I just wonder if you could talk for a moment about the ways that the pandemic and the COVID recession have thrown into relief the racism that you and others have been talking about for so long. And then, yeah, I guess to close, like, if you think it might, as a silver lining, this tragedy might help us stay woke and get movement going forward.
Yeah, so COVID has, like you said, there's a huge outbreak in OCCC, luckily, it's a little bit more under control now, as I understand, and we're seeing a lot of shuffling of leadership in the various government entities that have anything to do with controlling that. And so, it's so heartbreaking that it has come to this: outbreaks in prison, threatening illness and death among the people who are in society, kind of like at the least ability to protect themselves outside, and inside at no ability to protect themselves. And so, we see unrest. We had a riot last night at one of our jails as well. And people just, there's mass releases. There are kind of crises of reentry. There is community anxiety and fear. But I'm really hopeful that because we have reached this breaking point, we can see things more clearly now. And that, what I have seen as well in the course of my work is that the community has really risen up to support the people who are coming out. We have reentry service providers, we have churches, we have concerned citizens who are really speaking out and saying this is inhumane, and actually really starting to see more clearly how everything that led us to where we are now is also inhumane. And so I do think, and I hope that with this greater national discussion that has not skipped Hawaii, maybe much to the chagrin of our chief of Honolulu Police, but I think that there is a new discussion that is happening in a very more meaningful way in people's living rooms and bedrooms and in their hearts about whether these systems are actually just, who they support, who they protect, and that we will hopefully start to see some changes coming in the very near future. This is my sincerest hope.
Thank you. Ken, I'm going to give you the final word, but before we sign off, I just wanted to thank so many of the people who made this conversation possible. There's a lot of energy in this conversation. We need to have more of them. We need to translate words into action. So I hope you'll join us again, Kamaile, as we continue to kind of try to push these issues forward and make change that can last. This conversation it's sponsored by the Better Tomorrow series. That's a joint project of the UH Manoa Provost's Office, Kamehameha Schools, and the Hawaii Community Foundation. We also have support from the law school, the College of Social Sciences, and this conversation is also supported and has been promoted by a bunch of important organizations in town: the Hawaii ACLU, the Popolo Project, Kanu Hawaii, the Hawaii Innocence Project, the Scholar Strategy Network, Public Policy Center. I want to thank the IT department at UH Alumni Relations and the UH Foundation, UH Communications, all the students who are working behind the scenes to make all of these technical parts work as best we can. And of course, thank you, Kamaile and Paul and Ken, for joining us today at this important moment for Hawaii and this important moment globally. Ken, do you want to take us home?
Just thank you, Robert, for putting this all together. And Kamaile, it's always good seeing you. And Professor Butler, again, thank you for the inspiration. And really, all I want to say is this, that we as a nation, we as a world have seen where people are hurting and need help. And I guess the question has always been, and Professor Butler kind of stated, what are you going to do, right? Each of us has some responsibility. I truly believe that we were all put here our primary purpose for being here is to be of service to one another, to be of help to one another. And I'll just close by saying this, as the Dalai Lama said a long time ago, if our primary purpose is here on earth is to be here to help one another, then that's what we should be doing. But if you can't help, just don't hurt. If you can't help, just don't hurt. And so, again, thank you for doing this, Robert. And hopefully this conversation will lead to some action.
Thank you, Ken. I agree. This is a moment. These sort of moments don't come along very often when you can make a difference and there's an opportunity for major change. So it's a time for all of us, I think, to stand up and be heard if we can. And as you say, also not make things worse if we can. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Paul and Kamaile. And we'll carry this conversation forward in the future. Thank you so much. Aloha.